The steady beep of hospital equipment was the first sound that registered in Alexander Morgan's mind as consciousness gradually returned to him. His eyelids felt impossibly heavy, as if weighted down by invisible anchors. The sterile scent of antiseptic filled his nostrils, a harsh contrast to the bespoke cologne he typically wore while commanding boardrooms across Manhattan. When Alexander finally forced his eyes open, the harsh fluorescent lights above made him wince. His vision blurred, then slowly cleared, revealing a standard hospital room. Confusion flooded his mind. The last thing he remembered was leaving his penthouse office atop Morgan Enterprises' 60-story headquarters, heading for a crucial meeting with Japanese investors. "Mr. Morgan, you're awake." A nurse approached his bedside, checking the monitors. "I'll inform the doctor immediately." Alexander tried to speak, but his throat felt like sandpaper. The nurse offered him water through a straw, which he accepted gratefully. "What happened?" he finally managed, his normally authoritative voice reduced to a rasp. "You collapsed in your office 3 days ago, sir. Apparent heart attack. You've been in and out of consciousness since then." 3 days. Alexander's mind raced. The Japanese deal, the acquisition he'd spent 6 months orchestrating, was it lost? His hand instinctively reached for a phone that wasn't there. "Your assistant has been notified," the nurse added, seeming to read his thoughts. "She said everything is under control, and that you should focus on recovery." Alexander doubted that. Nothing at Morgan Enterprises ran properly without his direct oversight. That's how he'd built a $4.2 billion fortune from scratch. By controlling every detail, by never trusting others to handle what he could do better himself. Before he could inquire further, the door to his room burst open. A small figure darted past the startled nurse and rushed toward his bed. "Daddy, you finally woke up!" Alexander froze as a little girl, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, climbed onto the chair beside his bed. She had chestnut hair pulled into pigtails and eyes that mirrored his own distinctive hazel shade, a Morgan family trait. A small hand reached for his, and she squeezed it with surprising strength. "I was so scared," she continued, her voice trembling slightly. "Miss Rebecca said you were just sleeping for a little while, but it was so long." Alexander stared at the child in complete bewilderment. In his 42 years, he'd been meticulously careful to avoid precisely this scenario, an unplanned child. His relationships were calculated. Contractual arrangements with women who understood his lifestyle didn't include family complications. Yet there was something unnervingly familiar about the girl's features, the determined set of her jaw, the slight dimple in her left cheek. Behind her, a woman appeared in the doorway, her expression a mixture of relief and apprehension. "Emma, I told you to wait," she said gently to the child before turning to Alexander. "I'm sorry, she's been worried sick about you." Alexander didn't recognize the woman, yet there was something vaguely familiar about her too. His mind struggled to place her as she approached the bed. "My name is Theo Teller, and if this introduction has already piqued your curiosity, leave your light to follow the unfolding of this extraordinary journey. Which city are you watching this from? Let us know in the comments below." The woman stepped closer to Alexander's bed, placing a protective hand on the child's shoulder. "Emma, why don't you go with the nurse to get some juice while I talk to your father?" Her voice was gentle, but firm. Alexander watched in stunned silence as the nurse led the little girl away. The moment the door closed, he turned to the woman, his business instincts kicking in despite his physical weakness. "I don't know what kind of scam you're running," he said coldly, "but that child is not mine." The woman didn't flinch. Instead, she pulled a chair closer to his bed and sat down, meeting his gaze directly. "My name is Katherine Bennett, and yes, Alexander, Emma is absolutely your daughter." A memory stirred in the recesses of his mind. Katherine Bennett. The name transported him back nearly 8 years, to a charity gala in Boston. She had been working for the foundation, intelligent and passionate about marine conservation. They'd spent a weekend together, nothing more. He remembered appreciating her lack of interest in his wealth, her refreshing intellect. Then a crisis at his company had called him back to New York, and he'd never contacted her again. That's not possible, Alexander insisted, though doubt began creeping into his voice. I was careful, Katherine sighed, looking suddenly tired. Evidently not careful enough. I found out I was pregnant after you left. I tried to reach you, but your staff made it clear you weren't interested in speaking with me. Alexander's jaw tightened. He'd instructed his team to filter persistent romantic connections. It was standard protocol to protect him from exactly this type of situation. Why now? After all these years? Katherine's expression hardened. I never planned to tell you. I built a life for Emma and myself in Connecticut. I'm a marine biologist now, heading conservation projects. We were doing fine without you. Then why? Your mother found us, Katherine interrupted. Alexander felt as if he'd been doused with ice water. Eleanor Morgan, his formidable mother, was the only person in the world he couldn't fully control. 6 months ago, Katherine continued, she showed up at our door, said she'd hired investigators after seeing Emma's photo in a local newspaper article about a school science fair. Apparently, the Morgan genes are quite distinctive. Alexander closed his eyes briefly. His mother had been pestering him about his legacy for years, insisting the Morgan line shouldn't end with him. Eleanor has been visiting Emma weekly since then. She's the one who called me when you collapsed. She insisted Emma should know her father, especially if Katherine hesitated. If I died, Alexander finished flatly. Katherine nodded. The doctors were concerned. Your mother was surprisingly emotional. Alexander tried to process this information. His ruthlessly practical mother, emotional. The woman who taught him that sentimentality was weakness. Where is she now? My mother, handling some emergency at your company. She's been splitting her time between here and your office. Alexander leaned back against his pillows, processing the implications. Not only had his mother gone behind his back to find this child, but she'd also inserted herself into the company operations he'd explicitly barred her from years ago. I want a DNA test, he said firmly. Katherine reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope. Already done. Your mother arranged it last month using a toothbrush from your apartment. Results are conclusive. Emma is a Morgan. Alexander took the envelope with unsteady hands, scanning the document inside. The clinical language and percentages confirmed what the girl's hazel eyes had already told him. She was unquestionably his biological child. In the span of 10 minutes, Alexander Morgan, a man who controlled multinational corporations with surgical precision, had lost control of the most fundamental aspect of his identity. He was a father, had been, unknowingly, for years. What do you want from me? He asked, his businessman's mind automatically calculating potential costs and liabilities. Katherine's eyes flashed with anger. Nothing. We've never needed your money. I'm here because Emma deserves to know her father, and because your mother can be remarkably persuasive when she wants something. Before Alexander could respond, a commotion in the hallway caught their attention. The door swung open, and Eleanor Morgan swept in, 72 years old, impeccably dressed in a Chanel suit, her silver hair arranged in a perfect chignon. Alexander, she said, her voice brisk as she assessed him with critical eyes. You look terrible. Behind her, Emma peeked around the doorframe, watching the adults warily. Eleanor Morgan approached her son's hospital bed with the same commanding presence she brought to charity boards and social galas across Manhattan. She placed a cool hand against Alexander's forehead, an uncharacteristically maternal gesture. Your fever's gone down, she noted clinically before turning to Katherine. The board meeting went as expected. I've stabilized the situation temporarily, but they'll need Alexander to make a statement soon. Alexander stared at his mother in disbelief. You attended my board meeting. Those are closed sessions, Mother. Eleanor dismissed his concern with a wave of her manicured hand. I still own 12% of Morgan Enterprises, or have you forgotten? Besides, your team needed direction. That Davidson fellow was ready to announce your temporary incapacity to the press. Alexander's jaw tightened. Robert Davidson, his CFO, had been angling for more control for months. The Japanese delegation has been rescheduled for next week, Eleanor continued. I've assured them you'll be fully recovered by then. You had no right to interfere. Alexander said coldly. I had every right to protect what your father and I built, Eleanor countered, and what you'll leave to Emma someday. At the mention of the child, all three adults glanced toward the doorway where Emma still lingered. The girl's eyes were wide, absorbing the tension in the room. Katherine moved toward her daughter. Emma, why don't we go find that snack we talked about? But I want to stay with Grandma and Daddy, Emma protested, the word Daddy sending another shock through Alexander's system. Eleanor smiled at the child, a genuine smile Alexander rarely saw directed at himself. Go with your mother, darling. Your father needs to rest, and we'll have plenty of time to visit later. After Katherine ushered Emma from the room, Eleanor turned back to her son. Her expression hardened into the businesslike mask he knew so well. The doctors say you've been ignoring symptoms for months, working 18-hour days, subsisting on coffee and adrenaline. She shook her head disapprovingly. Just like your father. He worked himself into an early grave, too. I'm nothing like him, Alexander snapped, a lifetime of complicated emotions surfacing. You're exactly like him, Eleanor countered. Brilliant, driven, and completely blind to what actually matters. A doctor entered before Alexander could respond, interrupting their sparring match. The physician, a cardiologist named Dr. Patel, according to his badge, reviewed the monitors and examined Alexander thoroughly. The good news, Mr. Morgan, is that we intervened in time, Dr. Patel explained. The bad news is that this was a serious warning. Your heart shows signs of significant stress. When can I return to work? Alexander asked, ignoring his mother's disapproving click of the tongue. Dr. Patel's expression grew stern. This isn't something to rush, Mr. Morgan. You'll need at least 2 weeks of rest before even considering part-time work. Your body is telling you something. I suggest you listen. After the doctor left, Eleanor settled into the chair beside Alexander's bed. She reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a small photo album bound in blue leather. I thought you might want to see these, she said, placing it on his lap. Alexander reluctantly opened the album to find photographs of Emma as a toddler feeding ducks in a park, blowing out candles on birthday cakes, proudly holding up science fair ribbons. You've been spying on them for years, he accused, looking up from the album. Eleanor met his gaze steadily. I hired an investigator 6 months ago after seeing her picture in that newspaper. Once I confirmed she was yours, I reached out to Katherine. Why didn't you tell me immediately? Would you have listened? Eleanor challenged, or would you have buried yourself even deeper in work to avoid dealing with it? Alexander didn't answer, which was answer enough. Eleanor's voice softened slightly. That child is exactly like you at that age. Brilliant, curious, stubborn, she's already skipped a grade, and Katherine says she's obsessed with marine biology and business in equal measure. Despite himself, Alexander felt a flicker of something unfamiliar as he looked at a photo of Emma beaming beside a science project about ocean ecosystems. Pride, curiosity. Katherine seems competent, he said finally. She's exceptional, Eleanor corrected him. She's raised that child beautifully while building her own career. She wants nothing from you, Alexander. That's why I respect her. Alexander's brow furrowed. Then what am I supposed to do? That, Eleanor said, rising to her feet, is entirely up to you, but I suggest you think carefully before you throw away something precious, something even your billions can't buy. She gathered her belongings and headed for the door. I've arranged for Katherine and Emma to stay at the plaza while you recover. Emma wants to show you her science project tomorrow. I told her you'd be delighted. Before Alexander could object, his mother was gone, leaving him alone with a photo album of a life he'd never known existed and a decision that no spreadsheet or business strategy could help him make. Alexander stared at the ceiling of his hospital room long after his mother had departed, the photo album resting heavily on his lap. Outside, Manhattan continued its relentless pace, the city that never sleeps carrying on without its most driven resident. For the first time in decades, Alexander Morgan was forced to be still, to contemplate something other than quarterly reports and acquisition strategies. He flipped through the album again, studying Emma's face in each photograph. The resemblance was undeniable, not just to himself, but to the old photographs of his grandfather, the man who had started the Morgan fortune with nothing but determination and a small shipyard in Brooklyn. A memory surfaced, his grandfather teaching him chess when he was 7, the same age Emma appeared to be now. "Business is like chess, Alex," the old man had said. "Always think 5 moves ahead." Alexander had taken that lesson to heart, plotting his entire life with strategic precision, except for one weekend in Boston 8 years ago. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Katherine stood in the doorway, alone this time. "Emma's with your mother in the cafeteria," she explained, correctly interpreting his questioning look. Apparently, Eleanor promised to teach her how to properly evaluate fine china by tapping it with a spoon. "Your mother's idea of essential life skills is unique." Despite himself, Alexander felt his mouth twitch toward a smile. "She learned it from her mother. The Morgan women have always been formidable." Katherine entered the room hesitantly. "I wanted to check if you needed anything before we head to the hotel." "Sit down," Alexander said, then caught himself. It had come out as a command rather than an invitation. "Please," he added, the word feeling foreign on his tongue. Katherine took the seat beside his bed, her posture guarded. "Why didn't you pursue me?" Alexander asked directly. "For child support, acknowledgement, anything." Katherine's eyes reflected surprise at his bluntness. "I considered it when I first found out I was pregnant, but then I read an article about you, the lone wolf of Wall Street. The journalist asked about your future, if you wanted a family someday." Alexander winced, remembering the interview. "And I said family was an unnecessary distraction." Katherine nodded. "You said, I wasn't put on this earth to change diapers. I was put here to change industries. After that, it seemed clear that forcing fatherhood on you would be a mistake for everyone involved." Alexander felt a twinge of shame, hearing his callous words repeated back to him. "I had options," Katherine continued. "A supportive family, a good education. Emma has had a wonderful childhood with people who wanted to be in her life. Until my mother intervened," Alexander observed. "Eleanor was persuasive," Katherine admitted. "She argued that Emma deserved to know her heritage, her family history, and that you deserved a chance to know your daughter before—" She hesitated. "Before I worked myself into an early grave like my father," Alexander finished, recalling his mother's earlier comment. "Essentially, yes." Katherine's directness matched his own, a quality he rarely encountered, even in boardrooms filled with powerful men. Alexander studied her with new interest. She was different from the women he typically associated with. No obvious designer clothing or jewelry, just simple elegance and quiet confidence. Her resume, according to his mother, was impressive. PhD from MIT, published research, leadership position at a respected conservation organization. "What does Emma know about me?" he asked. "That her father is a businessman who builds ships and buildings. That you and I met when I was working for an ocean conservation charity, but weren't together long. That you didn't know about her until recently." "You didn't vilify me to her?" Alexander was genuinely surprised. Katherine shook her head. "What would be the point of that? I've always told her that families come in all different forms." Alexander glanced down at the photo album again, at a picture of Emma standing proudly beside a large aquarium exhibit. "My mother mentioned a science project." Katherine's expression softened. "Marine ecosystems. She's obsessed with ocean conservation and with business. Last year, she set up a lemonade stand to fund a beach cleanup project. created a whole business plan, recruited neighborhood kids as employees, maximized profits by setting up outside the community tennis courts during summer tournaments. A smile played at her lips. She's definitely your daughter. For the first time since waking up in the hospital, Alexander felt something other than confusion or anger. A peculiar warmth spread through his chest at the thought of this small entrepreneur with his eyes and his grandfather's determined chin. "I don't know how to be a father," he said finally, the admission costing him far more than the billions he regularly negotiated in business deals. "Nobody does at first," Katherine replied simply. "But if you're interested in learning, Emma would be the greatest beneficiary of that education." Their conversation was interrupted by the vibration of Katherine's phone. She checked the screen and stood up. "That's your mother. They are finished with their China evaluation lesson and heading back." Alexander found himself straightening in the bed, running a hand through his hair, as if preparing for an important meeting. Katherine paused at the door. "Alexander, you should know. I don't expect anything from you. If you decide you want to be part of Emma's life, it needs to be a commitment, not an impulse. She's a child, not a merger you can abandon if it doesn't meet quarterly expectations." The directness of her challenge stirred something in Alexander. Respect, perhaps. Few people spoke to him with such unvarnished honesty. "I understand," he said, and was surprised to realize he meant it. Stories like this remind us of the power of unexpected connections that can change our lives forever. If you believe in second chances, consider subscribing to not miss our next emotional journey. The following day brought unexpected challenges for Alexander Morgan, not in the form of hostile takeovers or market volatility, but in the shape of a determined 7-year-old carrying a science project poster board nearly as large as herself. "Be careful with that, Emma," Katherine cautioned as the girl maneuvered the unwieldy display through the hospital room door. "I got it, Mom," Emma insisted, her small face set with determination that was hauntingly familiar to Alexander. It was the same expression he saw in the mirror before challenging board decisions or launching particularly aggressive acquisitions. Eleanor followed behind them, carrying a bag that appeared to contain art supplies. The formidable Morgan matriarch had exchanged her usual designer suit for slacks and a cashmere sweater, what Alexander recognized as her version of casual attire. "Good morning, Alexander," Eleanor greeted him. "The doctors tell me your numbers are improving. Perhaps there's hope for you yet." Before Alexander could respond, Emma had propped her poster against the wall and approached his bedside with her hand extended. "Hello, Mr. Morgan," she said formally. "Thank you for agreeing to see my presentation." Alexander found himself shaking the small hand, noting the surprising firmness of her grip. "You're welcome," he replied, equally formal. Eleanor made a disapproving noise. "Really, Alexander? Mr. Morgan is hardly appropriate. Emma is your daughter, not a business associate." Emma glanced between the adults, then offered a solution with pragmatic confidence. "I could call you Alexander if Dad feels too weird." Alexander felt strangely touched by her consideration. "Alexander is fine," he agreed, ignoring his mother's disapproving expression. Emma nodded and launched into her presentation with a professionalism that belied her age. Her project, entitled Ocean Business: How Protecting Reefs Protects Profits, detailed the economic benefits of marine conservation. "Coral reefs generate $36 billion annually in tourism," she explained, pointing to a graph she'd clearly created herself. "When businesses invest in reef conservation, they're actually protecting their future revenue streams." Alexander found himself genuinely impressed. The child had intuitively grasped concepts of long-term investment and sustainability that many of his executives still struggled to comprehend. "Did your mother help you with this?" he asked when Emma paused for breath. Emma shook her head. "Mom helped me find research sources, but the analysis is mine. Grandma Eleanor says I have a natural head for business. Alexander caught his mother's smug smile from across the room. Eleanor had always believed business acumen was genetic, a Morgan family trait passed down through generations. What do you want to be when you grow up? Alexander found himself asking. Emma didn't hesitate. I'm going to be a marine conservation business specialist. I'll help companies make money by saving the oceans. The clarity of her vision was striking. At her age, Alexander had already known he would expand his family's shipping business into a global enterprise. He recognized the same certainty in her voice. That's a specific career path, he observed. Emma nodded seriously. Mom says if you want something to exist, sometimes you have to create it yourselves. Alexander glanced at Katherine, who was watching their interaction with careful attention. Their eyes met briefly, and he saw a complex mixture of emotions there: pride in her daughter, wariness about his involvement, and something else he couldn't quite define. As Emma continued her presentation, a nurse entered to check Alexander's vitals. The woman smiled at Emma's display. Quite the little professor you have there, she commented to Katherine. She gets her intelligence from her mother, Alexander found himself saying, surprising everyone in the room, including himself. Katherine blinked in surprise before recovering her composure. And her stubborn determination from her father's side, she countered with a small smile. Emma beamed at this exchange, clearly pleased by the acknowledgement of shared traits. When the presentation concluded, Alexander found himself asking questions, not just to be polite, but out of genuine interest. Emma's answers were thoughtful and occasionally startlingly insightful. You've done excellent research, he told her finally. Have you considered how to scale your conservation model internationally? Emma's eyes widened at the question. Not yet. Do you have suggestions? For the next half hour, Alexander Morgan, the titan of industry known for reducing seasoned executives to nervous wrecks, engaged in a serious business discussion with a 7-year-old. He found himself drawing diagrams, explaining concepts of international markets and cultural considerations for global conservation initiatives, while Emma absorbed everything with remarkable comprehension. Eleanor and Katherine exchanged glances as the conversation continued, their mutual surprise evident. Neither had expected this level of engagement from Alexander. Mother, Alexander said suddenly, looking up from his impromptu lesson, would you take Emma to the gift shop? I believe they have some books on marine biology that might interest her. Eleanor, recognizing his desire to speak privately with Katherine, nodded. Come along, Emma. Let's see what treasures we can find. After they left, Alexander turned to Katherine. His expression had shifted from the animated engagement of moments before to his more typical analytical assessment. She's extraordinary, he said simply. Katherine nodded, pride evident in her face. Yes, she is. I'd like to be involved in her education, Alexander continued. There are international marine conservation conferences she should attend, specialists she could learn from. Katherine's expression grew cautious. Alexander, while I appreciate your interest, throwing money and opportunities at Emma isn't the same as being her father. I'm aware of that, he replied, surprising her again. I'd like to try being that too, if you'll allow it. Katherine studied him carefully. What exactly are you proposing? Regular visits to start. Perhaps Emma could come to New York one weekend a month and I could visit Connecticut when my schedule permits. And when the novelty wears off, when there's a crucial business deal that conflicts with her school play or science fair. Alexander felt a flash of irritation at her doubt, then recognized it was entirely justified based on his track record. I can't promise I'll never disappoint her, but I can promise I'll try not to. Katherine remained silent, evaluating his sincerity. She has my eyes, Alexander said quietly, and my grandfather's chin. When she was explaining her profit projections, she used the exact same hand gesture my father used to make. The admission seemed to affect Katherine. I've noticed the similarities, she acknowledged. It's one reason I agreed to your mother's suggestion. Emma deserves to know where she comes from. A knock at the door interrupted them as Dr. Patel entered with Alexander's chart. Mr. Morgan, we have your latest test results, the doctor announced. While you're improving, I'm concerned about these ongoing stress indicators. Have you given any thought to the lifestyle changes we discussed? Alexander glanced at Katherine, then back to the doctor. Yes, I believe I have, starting with spending more time in Connecticut. 5 days after waking up in the hospital, Alexander Morgan was discharged with strict instructions for rest and rehabilitation. To the shock of his executive team, he announced he would be working remotely for the next month, splitting his time between his Manhattan penthouse and a rented property in Connecticut near Katherine and Emma. His chief operating officer, Victoria Chen, sat across from him in his penthouse living room, her expression a mixture of concern and disbelief as she reviewed his revised schedule. Alexander, the Japanese delegation is expecting you to lead the negotiations personally, she reminded him. They've already rescheduled once. Then they can reschedule again, or you can handle it, Alexander replied, scrolling through his tablet where he'd been researching Connecticut real estate. The acquisition documents are prepared. You know my terms. Victoria shook her head. This isn't like you. The Alexander Morgan I've worked with for the last decade would never delegate a $600 million acquisition. Alexander looked up, meeting her gaze directly. The Alexander Morgan you worked with had a heart attack at 42. Victoria fell silent, unable to argue with that stark reality. Besides, Alexander continued, I'm not abandoning the company. I'll be on video conferences daily, reviewing all major decisions. I'm simply reprioritizing certain aspects of my schedule. Because of this child? Victoria asked cautiously. News of Emma's existence had been contained to Alexander's innermost circle, his mother, his personal attorney, and Victoria, whose efficiency was essential to implementing his new arrangements. Her name is Emma, Alexander corrected, surprising himself with the protective edge in his voice. And yes, partly because of her, but also because Dr. Patel was quite clear about what will happen if I don't make changes. Victoria's expression softened slightly. She'd been with Morgan Enterprises since its early days, one of the few people Alexander trusted implicitly with business matters. I've taken the liberty of arranging for secure communications to be installed at whatever property you select in Connecticut, she said. And I've compiled dossiers on the local schools, should you wish to review them. Alexander felt a surge of gratitude for her unquestioning competence. Thank you, Victoria. After she departed, Alexander found himself alone in the vast penthouse that occupied the top 2 floors of the Morgan Enterprises building. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Manhattan, the empire he'd built visible in the very skyline. 3 Morgan-developed skyscrapers punctuated the horizon, testament to his vision and drive. For the first time, the space felt excessively empty rather than peaceful. His phone chimed with an incoming message, a photo from Eleanor showing Emma feeding ducks in Central Park, Alexander's childhood chess set visible on a bench beside her. His mother had evidently taken it upon herself to introduce Emma to Morgan family traditions. Another chime followed, a text from Katherine. Your mother is teaching Emma chess. Should I be concerned about the level of competitive intensity between them? Alexander found himself smiling as he typed back, Absolutely. The Morgan women don't believe in letting children win. Katherine's response came quickly. Emma just declared checkmate. Your mother looks stunned. Something warm and unfamiliar expanded in Alexander's chest. Pride, he realized. He was proud of this small person he barely knew. With sudden decisiveness, he called his real estate agent and instructed her to make an offer on the Connecticut property he'd been considering. Not a rental, but a purchase. 2 days later, Alexander was driving himself to Connecticut in his rarely used Aston Martin. His regular driver had offered to take him, but Alexander preferred solitude for this journey. The sleek vehicle hugged the curves of the coastal road as he headed toward the small, exclusive community where Katherine and Emma lived. The 2-hour drive gave him time to reflect on the extraordinarily strange week that had upended his meticulously planned life. From collapsing in his office to discovering he had a daughter, to rearranging his entire professional existence. None of it had been on his 5-year strategic plan. His grandfather's chess advice echoed in his mind. Always think 5 moves ahead. For the first time in his adult life, Alexander Morgan didn't know what his next move would be, let alone the 5 after that. The GPS directed him to a charming colonial home on a tree-lined street near the water. Katherine's house was modest by his standards, but impeccably maintained, with a small garden where scientific-looking equipment, weather monitoring devices, and what appeared to be a rain collection system stood alongside more traditional landscaping. Before he could exit his car, the front door opened and Emma burst out, racing down the path with unconstrained excitement. Katherine followed more sedately, her expression cautiously welcoming. "You came," Emma exclaimed, stopping short of hugging him but bouncing slightly on her toes. "Mum said you were coming for lunch but might need to leave for work emergencies." Alexander glanced at Katherine, understanding that she had been managing Emma's expectations about his reliability. "No emergencies today," he assured them both. "I've cleared my schedule." Katherine raised an eyebrow slightly but nodded. "We're having lobster rolls and clam chowder." Emma insisted on a proper New England welcome. "I researched typical Connecticut cuisine," Emma explained seriously as she led him toward the house. "Did you know that the first hamburger in America was created in New Haven in 1900? "I didn't," Alexander admitted, allowing himself to be guided by this small, enthusiastic tour director. The interior of Katherine's home revealed her personality more clearly than their hospital interactions had. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with scientific texts and marine biology references. Framed photographs documented Emma's life alongside Katherine's professional achievements. A well-worn couch faced a modest television, while a dining table in the connected space was already set for lunch, complete with what appeared to be hand-drawn place cards. "I made yours," Emma said, pointing to the elaborate card bearing his name, decorated with surprisingly well-rendered ships and buildings. "It's excellent," Alexander told her, genuinely impressed by the detail. As Katherine moved to the kitchen to finish lunch preparations, Emma gave Alexander what she called the official tour, proudly showing off her bedroom with its marine-themed decorations, her bookshelf organized by subject matter, and her small desk where she worked on her business plans. "Grandma Eleanor says you have an office with a view of the whole city," Emma commented. "She says you can see everything you've built from your windows." "That's true," Alexander confirmed. Emma considered this. "Our house is small, but from my bedroom window you can see the ocean. Mom says that's worth more than any building." Alexander found himself without a ready response, an unusual circumstance for a man known for his quick verbal acuity in any situation. "Your mother might be right," he finally said. When they returned downstairs, Katherine had set out lunch on the deck, overlooking a small but well-tended backyard that sloped gently toward the distant shoreline. The meal was simple but delicious, a far cry from the elaborate restaurant fare or precisely calibrated nutritionist-approved meals that typically constituted Alexander's diet. The conversation flowed more easily than he had anticipated, with Emma serving as an enthusiastic bridge between the adults. She peppered Alexander with questions about his business, his ships, his buildings, displaying an insatiable curiosity about the father she'd just discovered. Do you have brothers or sisters? She asked between bites of her lobster roll. No, Alexander answered. I was an only child. Like me, Emma noted. Do you think it's lonely being an only child? The question caught him off guard, not because of its content, but because of its insight. He considered his answer carefully. Sometimes, he admitted, though I was often too busy to notice. What did you do when you were my age? Emma continued, her hazel eyes, so like his own, watching him intently. Alexander found himself sharing stories he rarely thought about. Sailing with his grandfather, learning chess, his first investment, a lemonade stand like Emma's, though his had been focused on profit rather than environmental conservation. Katherine observed their interaction quietly, occasionally adding context or gently redirecting when Emma's questions became too personal. Alexander found himself increasingly aware of Katherine's presence, her subtle guidance of the conversation, her obvious devotion to Emma, the intelligence that shone in her eyes when they discussed Emma's education or her own research. As lunch concluded, Emma asked the question Alexander had been both expecting and dreading. Are you going to stay in our lives now, or will you go back to just being busy in New York? Emma's direct question hung in the air between them. Alexander felt Katherine's eyes on him, gauging his response. In boardrooms across the globe, he was known for his quick, decisive answers. But now, faced with a 7-year-old's simple query, he found himself searching carefully for the right words. I would like to be part of your life, Emma, he finally said, meeting her gaze. I've purchased a house not far from here. I'll be splitting my time between Connecticut and New York. Emma's eyes widened. You bought a house just to be near us? I did, Alexander confirmed, noting the surprise on Katherine's face as well. He hadn't mentioned the purchase to her yet. It's about 15 minutes from here, an old colonial on Lighthouse Point. Katherine's expression shifted from surprise to something more complex. The Beckett property, that's been on the market for over a year. It needs significant renovation. I'm aware, Alexander replied. The contractors start next week. Emma was practically bouncing in her seat. Can I see it? Does it have a view of the ocean? Does it have room for a laboratory? Alexander smiled slightly at her enthusiasm. Yes, you can see it. Yes, it has an ocean view. And I'm sure we can arrange for a laboratory space, if that's what you'd like. Alexander, Katherine interjected, her tone cautious. Purchasing a house is a significant commitment. Are you certain this isn't an impulsive reaction to recent events? It was a fair question. Alexander Morgan wasn't known for impulsive decisions, but rather for calculated moves that always served his long-term strategy. This was different. When I was 7, he said slowly, my father missed my school science exhibition because of a business emergency in Singapore. It was the 3rd school event he'd missed that year. I told myself then that it didn't matter, that I understood the importance of his work. He paused, the memory surprisingly clear after so many years. But it did matter. I promised myself that when I had children, I would do better. But you decided not to have children, Katherine pointed out gently. No, Alexander corrected. I decided business was more important than family. I was wrong. The admission felt strange on his lips. Alexander Morgan rarely admitted to being wrong about anything. Emma observed this exchange with the careful attention of a child who had grown accustomed to deciphering adult conversations. Does this mean you'll come to my science fair next month? She asked, bringing the abstract discussion back to concrete reality. Alexander nodded. I'll be there. You might have meetings, Emma said, showing surprising awareness of adult constraints. Then I'll reschedule them, Alexander replied firmly. Katherine's expression remained guarded, but Alexander could see a glimmer of something else there too. Hope, perhaps, that he meant what he was saying. After lunch, they decided to drive to the Beckett property so Emma could see Alexander's new house. The colonial sat on 2 acres of land, overlooking the Long Island Sound, its white clapboard exterior weathered by decades of salt air. The house itself was grand but neglected, with peeling paint and overgrown gardens. "It needs work," Alexander acknowledged as they stood in the circular driveway. "It has character," Katherine corrected, surprising him with her defense of the property. "These old houses tell stories." Emma was already racing toward the backyard, drawn by the glimpse of water beyond. Alexander and Katherine followed more slowly. "You didn't mention you were house hunting," Katherine said quietly. "It was a recent decision," Alexander replied. "After seeing Emma's reaction to my mention of Connecticut visits, I realized hotel stays wouldn't be appropriate. She deserves stability." Katherine studied him for a moment. "And what about your business? Morgan Enterprises is your life's work." "It still is," Alexander assured her. "But I've built a competent executive team over the years. Perhaps it's time I allowed them to execute more of my vision while I diversify my investments." Katherine's lips quirked into a small smile. "You're speaking about spending time with your daughter, as if it's a business strategy." Alexander felt a moment of discomfort, then acknowledged her point with a slight nod. "Old habits, I'm learning." They reached the back of the property where Emma stood transfixed by the expansive view of the Sound. Beyond the overgrown terrace, stone steps led down to a private beach area. "Alexander," she called excitedly, "there's a tide pool down there." As they joined her at the edge of the terrace, Alexander's phone rang, the specialized tone he'd assigned to Victoria Chen, which signaled a genuine business emergency. Both Katherine and Emma looked at him, their expressions a study in contrasts. Emma hopeful, but prepared for disappointment. Katherine resigned, as if this moment would confirm her expectations. Alexander looked at the phone, then at Emma, then out at the Sound, stretching toward the horizon. He silenced the call and returned the phone to his pocket. "Show me this tide pool," he said to Emma. The genuine smile that lit her face made something shift inside Alexander's chest, something fundamental that had been constructed over decades of ambitious striving and emotional isolation. A wall crumbling, perhaps, or a door opening. As Emma led them down the stone steps, chattering excitedly about the marine life they might discover, Katherine leaned closer to Alexander. "That looked important," she observed, nodding toward his pocket, where the silenced phone resided. "It probably was," he acknowledged, "yet you didn't answer." Alexander considered his response carefully. "I've spent 20 years teaching my company that everything I do is more important than anything they do. That's going to take time to undo." Katherine's eyes reflected surprise at his self-awareness. "And you want to undo it?" "I want to try," he replied honestly. They reached the bottom of the stairs where Emma was already crouched by a natural depression in the rocks, pointing excitedly at tiny marine creatures visible in the clear water. "Look," she exclaimed, "sea anemones and hermit crabs. This could be my research station." Alexander knelt beside her, designer trousers making contact with damp stone without hesitation. Another first. "Tell me about them," he said, genuinely interested in hearing her expertise. As Emma launched into a detailed explanation of the tide pool ecosystem, Alexander glanced up to find Katherine watching them with an expression he couldn't quite identify, a mixture of caution and something warmer. When their eyes met, she didn't look away. Later, as they explored the interior of the house, Alexander's phone rang again, this time with his mother's distinctive tone. He excused himself to take the call. "Mother," he answered, stepping into what would eventually become the library. "Alexander," Eleanor's voice was sharp with concern. "Victoria tells me you've ignored 3 urgent calls about the Nakamura deal. The Japanese are threatening to walk." "I'm aware," he replied calmly. "You're aware?" His mother's voice rose slightly. "Alexander, this is a $600 million acquisition you've been pursuing for months. What could possibly be more important? Through the doorway, Alexander could see Emma examining the built-in bookshelves in the adjacent room, measuring their height with her arms, while Katherine looked on with amused affection. "I'm showing Emma the house," he said simply. A long silence followed. Then, remarkably, Eleanor Morgan laughed, a genuine sound Alexander rarely heard from his formidable mother. "Well," she said finally, "perhaps there's hope for you yet. Should I tell Victoria to handle the call?" "Yes," Alexander decided. "Tell her my parameters haven't changed. If Nakamura can't accept our terms, we walk away. There are other shipping companies." "There are other business deals," Eleanor agreed, her voice uncharacteristically gentle. "But only one, Emma." After ending the call, Alexander rejoined Katherine and Emma in their exploration of the house. As they climbed the grand staircase to the second floor, Emma raced ahead, opening doors and exclaiming over each new discovery. "This could be my room," she called from a sun-filled corner bedroom with windows facing the sound. "I could see the sunrise every morning." Katherine and Alexander exchanged a glance, both recognizing the implication of Emma's excitement, that she expected to spend significant time here. "She moves quickly," Katherine murmured. "Emotionally, I mean. When she decides to trust someone, like choosing a stock," Alexander said. "All in or nothing." Katherine smiled slightly at his financial metaphor. "Something like that. Just be careful with her heart, Alexander. It's precious to me." "I know," he replied, surprising himself with the depth of emotion behind those simple words. As they continued their tour, reaching the master suite with its panoramic water views, Alexander's phone vibrated again. This time, it was a text from Victoria. "Nakamura agreed to original terms. Signed, LOI being drafted now. Whatever you're doing, it's working." Alexander slipped the phone back into his pocket without replying, his attention drawn to Emma, who had discovered a small sitting room adjacent to the master bedroom. "This could be a library for your business books," she was saying excitedly, "and maybe some of my science ones too." "I think that's an excellent suggestion," Alexander told her, earning a beaming smile in return. As the afternoon light began to fade, casting long shadows across the overgrown grounds, Alexander realized something profound had shifted in his world. The market updates that normally dominated his thoughts had been replaced by considerations of tide pools and bookshelves and a child's smile. For a man who measured his life in acquisitions and assets, Alexander Morgan had just made the most significant investment of his career. Not in property or companies, but in something far more valuable and infinitely more complex: a relationship with his daughter. The month that followed Alexander's purchase of the Connecticut house proved to be one of the most transformative periods of his life. The property underwent rapid renovation, with crews working around the clock to transform the neglected colonial into a home that balanced historic charm with modern amenities. Alexander approached the renovation with the same intensity he brought to corporate acquisitions, with one significant difference: Emma was his primary consultant on the project. 3 weeks after their initial visit, Alexander drove Emma and Katherine to see the progress. The exterior had been completely restored, the weathered clapboard replaced and painted a crisp white, the original shutters refurbished and rehung in a deep navy blue. Gardens had been cleared and replanted according to a landscape designer's plans, though Alexander had insisted on preserving the direct path to the tide pools that had so enchanted Emma. "It looks like a different house," Katherine remarked as they pulled into the circular driveway, which had been repaved with cobblestones salvaged from a historic property in Boston. "Wait until you see inside," Alexander replied, unable to completely suppress the pride in his voice. This project had consumed his attention in a way that differed from his usual business ventures. There was a personal satisfaction in creating this space that surpassed even his most successful corporate achievements. Emma raced ahead as they entered through the grand front door, which had been restored to its original glory with hand-forged hardware. The interior transformation was even more dramatic than the exterior. The formerly dark, cramped rooms now flowed into one another, with walls removed where appropriate to create open, light-filled spaces while still maintaining the home's historic character. "My room! I want to see my room!" Emma called, already halfway up the sweeping staircase. Katherine raised an eyebrow at Alexander. "Her room?" She expressed a preference for the southeast corner bedroom, Alexander explained, feeling unexpectedly defensive. "I thought it prudent to ensure it would be suitable for her comfort during visits." Katherine's expression softened with amusement. "You sound like you're describing a corporate accommodation, not a child's bedroom." Alexander acknowledged her observation with a slight nod. "Old habits." They followed Emma upstairs to find her standing in the doorway of her room, momentarily speechless, a rare condition for the normally verbose child. The room had been transformed into every marine biology-obsessed child's dream. One wall featured a large built-in aquarium, currently empty, but with all filtration systems installed and ready. Opposite stood floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, with a rolling ladder providing access to the upper reaches. A window seat overlooked the sound, with storage beneath for specimens and equipment. A desk stood in one corner, positioned to take advantage of the natural light, with a state-of-the-art microscope already in place. "You made me a laboratory," Emma finally whispered, turning to Alexander with wide eyes. "The aquarium systems were designed by the team from the New England Aquarium," he explained, finding himself uncharacteristically nervous about her approval. "There's a dedicated water line with special filtration for marine environments, and the temperature control system is—" His technical explanation was cut short as Emma threw herself forward, wrapping her arms around his waist in a fierce hug. Alexander froze for a moment, then tentatively placed a hand on her back. "Thank you," she said, her voice muffled against his cashmere sweater. Over Emma's head, Alexander met Katherine's gaze. Her eyes shimmered with unexpected moisture, and she gave him a small nod of approval that somehow meant more than the accolades of countless business publications. "There's a similar setup in the basement," Alexander continued when Emma finally released him. "For larger specimens and experiments, the renovation team consulted with marine biology professors from Yale to ensure it would meet research standards." "Can I see it?" Emma asked eagerly. "After we finish the upstairs tour," Katherine interjected gently. "Let's not overwhelm Alexander all at once." As they continued through the house, the evidence of Alexander's attention to detail was everywhere. The master suite had been redesigned with understated luxury, while the adjacent room, originally planned as a home office, had been converted into a sitting room with comfortable seating and yet more bookshelves. "For reading together," Alexander explained briefly when Katherine gave him a questioning look. "Emma mentioned enjoying being read to before bed." The tour concluded in the kitchen, where a professional-grade setup coexisted with warm, welcoming elements like the farmhouse table positioned to capture views of both the garden and the distant water. "The house is remarkable, Alexander," Katherine said, as Emma explored the pantry. "But this level of investment concerns you," he finished for her. "It suggests expectations," she clarified, "about Emma's presence here, about our arrangement." Alexander considered his response carefully. In business, he preferred clarity over ambiguity, direct terms over implied understandings. Perhaps the same approach would serve here. "I would like Emma to consider this her second home," he said. "To feel comfortable spending time here, whether for weekends or longer visits during school breaks. As for arrangements between us, Katherine, I propose we prioritize Emma's well-being and determine other parameters as we proceed." Katherine seemed to appreciate his straightforwardness. "That's reasonable. But children need consistency, Alexander. This can't be an enthusiasm that fades when business demands increase or when the novelty wears off. I understand, he replied, and found that he did. In the short week since discovering Emma's existence, his priorities had shifted in ways he was still coming to understand. The Nakamura acquisition had closed successfully the previous week, adding significant value to Morgan Enterprises, yet Alexander had found his satisfaction derived less from the business victory than from the fact that finalizing the deal freed his weekend to attend Emma's Science Club exhibition. Their conversation was interrupted by Emma's return, her expression serious as she studied them both. At 7, she was remarkably perceptive about adult dynamics. "Are you talking about me?" she asked directly. "Yes," Alexander answered, earning a quick look of surprise from Katherine. He had quickly learned that Emma valued honesty above reassurance. "We're discussing how best to arrange your time between your home with your mother and your time here." Emma nodded, accepting his frankness. "Will you live here all the time now, or still in New York too?" "Both," Alexander explained. "I'll be in New York during the week for work, but here on weekends and some weekdays when possible." "And I'll come on some weekends?" she pressed. Alexander glanced at Katherine, deferring to her judgment on this point. After a moment, she nodded. "We'll start with 1 weekend a month," Katherine said, "and evaluate as we go. School needs to remain your priority, Emma. Then the science fair is still the most important thing this month," Emma added seriously. "Absolutely," Alexander confirmed. "I've already cleared my calendar for the entire day." The remainder of their visit was spent exploring the grounds, where the landscapers had created defined garden areas while preserving natural elements. A stone path led down to the beach, where a small dock jutted into the water. Alexander explained that he'd arranged for a research boat to be delivered the following month, suitable for Emma's tide pool investigations, under appropriate adult supervision. As they prepared to leave, Alexander's phone rang with his mother's distinctive tone. "Excuse me," he said, stepping away to take the call. "Hello, Mother." Alexander. Eleanor's voice held an unusual note of urgency. "I've just received a call from Philip Warner." Alexander's body tensed immediately. Philip Warner was the senior partner at Warner Blackstone and Reed, the law firm that had represented Morgan Enterprises for 3 generations. "What did he want?" Alexander asked, already mentally reviewing recent deals for potential legal complications. "It's not business," Eleanor replied. "It's about Katherine and Emma." Alexander moved further away from Katherine and Emma, who were examining a garden sculpture near the driveway. "Explain," he demanded, his voice dropping to ensure they couldn't overhear. "Philip was contacted by a journalist from the Financial Times. They're working on a profile of you, apparently triggered by the Nakamura acquisition, and they've somehow discovered Emma's existence." Cold dread settled in Alexander's stomach. His privacy had always been fiercely guarded, his personal life kept separate from his public persona as a business leader. The thought of Emma being thrust into the public eye, subjected to the scrutiny that accompanied the Morgan name, was deeply unsettling. "How much do they know?" he asked. "Enough," Eleanor replied grimly. "They have Katherine's name, her profession. They know Emma's age, which makes the timeline of your non-relationship rather clear. They're requesting comment before publication next week." Alexander's mind raced through potential responses, contingencies, damage control strategies. Then his gaze fell on Emma, who was laughing at something Katherine had said, her face alight with uncomplicated joy in the afternoon sunlight. "I need to speak with Katherine about this," he said finally. "Alexander," his mother's voice held a warning note, "the board will have concerns about how this affects the company image. There are shareholders to consider." For the first time in his business career, Alexander found himself entirely unconcerned with shareholder sentiment. "The board will adapt," he said firmly. "Emma is my priority now." After ending the call, Alexander stood for a moment, watching Katherine and Emma by the sculpture. They had created a life together, a good one, balanced and loving, without his knowledge or participation. Now his sudden presence threatened to disrupt that peace, to expose them to a level of scrutiny they had never sought. As he walked back toward them, Alexander realized he had reached the most crucial decision point of this unexpected journey. The coming days would determine whether his presence in Emma's life would ultimately benefit her or harm her. For a man accustomed to measuring success in financial terms, the metrics had suddenly shifted to something far more valuable and infinitely more fragile: his daughter's happiness and well-being. The drive back to Katherine's house was filled with Emma's excited chatter about the renovations and her plans for the aquarium in her new room. Alexander responded appropriately, but Katherine noticed his distraction, the slight furrow between his brows that hadn't been there before the phone call. When they arrived at Katherine's home, she suggested Emma go upstairs to organize her research notes for the science fair. Once the child was out of earshot, Katherine turned to Alexander. "Something's wrong," she stated rather than asked. "What was that call about?" Alexander hesitated only briefly before deciding on complete transparency. "A journalist from the Financial Times has discovered Emma's existence. They're planning to run a story next week about my secret daughter as part of a broader profile." Katherine paled visibly, sinking into a chair at her kitchen table. "How? We've been so careful. The Nakamura acquisition raised my profile. Journalists dig deeper when there's major news." Alexander joined her at the table. "My attorney was notified. They're requesting comment." "Comment?" Katherine's voice rose slightly before she caught herself, glancing toward the stairs. More quietly, she continued, "This isn't business, Alexander. This is our daughter's life." Our daughter. The phrase registered with Alexander, the first time Katherine had acknowledged their shared connection to Emma so directly. "I understand," he said. "That's why I wanted to discuss this with you immediately. There are several approaches we could take." Katherine's eyes narrowed slightly. "You already have a strategy." It wasn't a question, and Alexander recognized that she was beginning to understand how his mind worked, always analyzing, always planning contingencies. "Three potential strategies," he corrected. "We can deny and threaten legal action if they publish without proofs. We can provide a brief controlled statement confirming Emma's existence but requesting privacy. Or we can take control of the narrative entirely." "What does that mean?" Katherine asked warily. "It means we give one exclusive interview to a journalist we select on our terms in a controlled environment. We establish the narrative rather than responding to someone else's." Katherine was already shaking her head. "I don't want Emma involved in a media circus. She's 7 years old, Alexander. She deserves a normal childhood." "Normal childhood," Alexander repeated, a hint of bitterness coloring his tone. "I was photographed for Forbes at age 8, standing beside my father while he explained how I would someday inherit the Morgan empire. There's no normal when it comes to this family, Katherine." An uncomfortable silence stretched between them, bridging years of fundamentally different lives and perspectives. "I'm not your father," Katherine finally said, her voice gentle but firm. "And Emma isn't you. We've given her a normal life so far, and I intend to preserve that as much as possible." Alexander felt an unexpected surge of emotion, something between envy for Emma's protected childhood and gratitude toward Katherine for providing it. "Then we use legal channels," he said decisively. "My attorneys will issue cease and desist letters to the Financial Times. We'll make it clear that any story involving a minor will result in immediate litigation." "Will that work?" Katherine asked. her pragmatism reasserting itself. Possibly. Many publications won't risk the legal expenses. Alexander hesitated. But if they decide the story is too valuable to suppress, we should be prepared for what follows. Katherine rubbed her temples, clearly processing the implications. Emma's friends, her school, our neighbors. Everything would change. Yes, Alexander acknowledged. He reached across the table, a gesture he would have found unthinkable just weeks ago, and covered Katherine's hand with his own. But we would face it together. I can provide security, media training, whatever becomes necessary. Emma would never face this alone. Katherine looked at their hands, then at his face, searching for something. You've changed, she observed quietly. I'm trying to, he answered honestly. Their moment was interrupted by the sound of Emma descending the stairs. They separated naturally as she entered the kitchen, but something had shifted between them. A new alliance formed in the face of a common threat. Mom, can we have dinner at the new house next weekend? Emma asked, oblivious to the tension in the room. I want to test the kitchen. Katherine managed to smile. We'll see, sweetheart. Alexander might be busy with work. Actually, Alexander interjected, I think that's an excellent idea. I'll arrange for a chef for our first official dinner. Emma's expression brightened, then quickly turned suspicious. Can we help cook? I don't just want some fancy person doing everything. Alexander glanced at Katherine, who seemed equally surprised by his dinner suggestion. Of course, he agreed. Perhaps the chef could teach us all how to prepare something together. This compromise satisfied Emma, who launched into detailed plans for their upcoming dinner. As she talked, Alexander received a text from his attorney. FT pushing for comment by tomorrow. Board chairman requesting emergency meeting tonight. Alexander replied concisely, no comment to FT. Delay board until I call in 30 minutes. When Emma finally paused for breath, Alexander excused himself. I need to make a few work calls, but I'll see you both next weekend for our dinner. As he moved toward the door, Katherine followed. You're not telling me everything, she said quietly, as Emma became distracted by a book on the coffee table. The board is concerned, Alexander admitted. This story complicates certain business relationships. Your reputation as the lone wolves, Katherine surmised. Among other things. Alexander hesitated, then added, some of our investors and partners are quite traditional. A secret child narrative doesn't align with the Morgan Enterprises image. Katherine's expression hardened slightly. Emma isn't a public relations problem to be managed, Alexander. To me, no, he agreed. To the board, unfortunately, everything is a potential liability. He checked his watch. I need to speak with them now. Set the parameters clearly. Katherine studied him for a moment, then nodded. Do what you need to do. Just remember where your priorities should lie now. I know exactly where they lie, Alexander replied with uncharacteristic intensity, and the board will understand that too, very shortly. The drive back to his Manhattan penthouse gave Alexander time to organize his thoughts. By the time he sat at his desk overlooking the city skyline, he had formulated a clear approach for the emergency board meeting. The video conference began precisely at 8 o'clock. 9 faces appeared on his screen, the senior leadership of Morgan Enterprises, men and women who collectively controlled billions in assets and influenced markets worldwide. James Harrington, the board chairman and his father's oldest friend, spoke first. Alexander, we've received concerning information from Philip Warner about a potential media situation. The timing, with the Nakamura deal just closed, is particularly unfortunate. Alexander noted the careful language, media situation, rather than your secret daughter, corporate euphemisms for messy human realities. The situation is straightforward, Alexander replied. I have a 7-year-old daughter named Emma. Her mother is Dr. Katherine Bennett, a marine biologist. I became aware of Emma's existence only recently, and I am now taking an active role in her life. The bluntness of his statement clearly caught several board members off guard. Victoria Chen recovered first. "Alexander, we completely understand and support your personal situation," she began diplomatically. "Our concern is the potential market impact if this information emerges in an uncontrolled manner. The Sato Group in particular has very traditional values regarding family matters." Alexander recognized the reference to their largest Japanese investor, the very group that had backed the Nakamura acquisition. "I appreciate the concern," he said evenly. "However, I want to be absolutely clear about something. My relationship with my daughter is not a corporate matter, and it is not subject to board approval or oversight." Harrington's expression tightened. "No one is suggesting oversight, Alexander, but proper messaging is crucial. Perhaps a statement acknowledging the situation, expressing your commitment to both your family and the company." "No statements," Alexander interrupted. "No press releases, no carefully crafted narratives. My attorneys will handle the legal aspects of protecting Emma's privacy. The company's official position is that we do not comment on the personal lives of our executives." "That stance may not be sufficient," another board member warned. "The market responds to uncertainty with caution. Our stock price will reflect the company's performance," Alexander finished firmly, "which remains exceptional." Victoria Chen studied him through the screen. "This matters to you more than business considerations." It wasn't a question, but Alexander answered anyway. "Yes." A brief silence followed as the board members processed this revelation, that Alexander Morgan, the man who had once famously worked through his father's funeral reception to close a deal, was now prioritizing something above business interests. "I'm restructuring my schedule permanently," Alexander continued into the silence. "I'll be working from Connecticut every Friday through Sunday. Victoria will handle any emergencies during those periods unless absolutely critical." Harrington leaned forward. "Alexander, I've known you since you were a child. Your dedication to this company has been absolute. This sudden change is concerning." "On the contrary," Alexander countered, "it should reassure you. I've recognized an imbalance in my life that, left uncorrected, would likely have resulted in another health crisis. This adjustment makes me more effective, not less." The discussion continued for another hour, with various board members expressing concerns, suggesting compromise approaches, and finally, grudgingly accepting Alexander's position. When the call ended, he sat alone in his penthouse, the city lights glittering beyond his windows. For the first time in his career, Alexander had placed a boundary around Morgan Enterprises, defining where the company ended and his personal life began. It felt both terrifying and strangely liberating. His phone lit up with a text from Katherine. "Emma wants to say goodnight. Video call, okay?" Alexander accepted immediately. Emma's face appeared on his screen, her hair damp from a bath, her expression sleepy but content. "I made a list of experiments for my new laboratory," she informed him seriously. 23 so far." "That sounds ambitious," Alexander replied, feeling the tension of the board meeting dissipate. "Mom says we need to prioritize," Emma continued. "Like you do with business things." Alexander glanced past Emma to where Katherine was visible in the background, folding laundry but clearly monitoring the call. "Your mother is very wise," he said. After Emma had said goodnight, Katherine took the phone. "How did your call go?" she asked, her voice lowered slightly. "As expected," Alexander replied. "The board has been informed of my new priorities." Katherine's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Thank you," she said simply. After they disconnected, Alexander walked to his floor-to-ceiling windows, gazing out at the Manhattan skyline. So many of those buildings bore the Morgan name or had been financed through his company. For most of his adult life, That vista had represented the totality of his achievement, his purpose. Now, for the first time, he found himself looking beyond the skyline toward the northeast, where the lights of Connecticut twinkled faintly in the distance, where a small house stood with ocean views, marine biology books, and a child with his eyes who thought 23 experiments was a reasonable starting point. Perhaps, Alexander reflected, success could be measured in ways he had never before considered. 6 months later, the coastal Connecticut community had grown accustomed to the sight of Alexander Morgan's Aston Martin navigating its winding roads each Thursday evening as he arrived for his extended weekends. The initial flurry of gossip had subsided, replaced by a matter-of-fact acceptance of the billionaire's presence among them. The Financial Times article had indeed been published, though with significantly less detail than originally threatened. Alexander's legal team had succeeded in minimizing the story to a brief mention within a broader profile about the Nakamura acquisition. The piece noted simply that Morgan, 42, recently acknowledged paternity of a child from a previous relationship and has purchased a residence in Connecticut to facilitate co-parenting arrangements. What the article couldn't capture was how profoundly that simple statement had changed Alexander's life. On a crisp autumn Saturday, Alexander stood at the edge of his property, watching Emma direct a small team of graduate students from Yale's marine biology department. Katherine had arranged for her daughter to participate in a citizen science project monitoring tidal ecosystems, and Emma had enthusiastically volunteered her father's private beach as a research site. Mr. Morgan, one of the students approached him nervously. Emma suggested we install permanent monitoring equipment at 3 points along your shoreline. Would that be acceptable to you? Alexander nodded. Of course. My property manager will provide whatever assistance you need. Just ensure none of the equipment interferes with the natural habitat. The student looked relieved. Thank you, sir. Emma mentioned you'd want to review the data collection protocols as well. Alexander glanced over at his daughter, who was solemnly explaining something to the other students, their small hands gesturing emphatically. I trust my daughter's scientific judgment, he replied. If the protocols meet with her approval, they meet with mine. The words still felt strange sometimes. My daughter, but increasingly natural with each passing week. As the students returned to their work, Katherine joined Alexander on the lawn. In the months since that first hospital encounter, a careful friendship had developed between them, built on their shared commitment to Emma's well-being and gradual discoveries of common interests and complementary perspectives. She's in her element, Katherine observed, watching Emma. The professor told me she asks more insightful questions than most undergraduate students. Alexander felt the now familiar surge of pride. Have you given more thought to the specialized academic programs we discussed? The Marine Science Academy in Boston has an exceptional gifted program, Katherine sighed. We've talked about this, Alexander. I think Emma benefits from a normal school environment with broader social experiences. The enrichment program she's doing now provide plenty of academic challenge. It was an ongoing discussion between them. Alexander constantly seeking the most exceptional opportunities for Emma, Katherine advocating for balance and normalcy. You may be right, Alexander conceded, surprising her. I was pushed into exclusive academic environments early. The results were academically successful, but perhaps socially limiting. Katherine's expression softened. You're getting better at seeing beyond the resume-building aspects of childhood. I'm trying, he acknowledged, though old habits persist. They stood in comfortable silence, watching Emma work. The past 6 months had brought numerous adjustments to all their lives. The custody and visitation schedule they had established meant Emma now spent every other weekend and one additional night each week at Alexander's house. During school holidays, the arrangements were more flexible, with Emma sometimes dividing her time between both homes. For Alexander, the most profound changes had been internal. The heart attack that had landed him in the hospital had served as both a physical and existential wake-up call. His doctors had been clear about the need for lifestyle modifications, but meeting Emma had provided the motivation to actually implement them. His working hours had decreased from an unsustainable 80+ per week to a more reasonable 50. He delegated more, trusted his team to execute without his constant oversight, and discovered that Morgan Enterprises not only survived this approach, but thrived under it. The company's stock had reached record highs the previous quarter, prompting the Wall Street Journal to run a profile titled "Morgan's New Management Philosophy: Less is More." The Financial Times called again, Alexander mentioned casually. They want to do a follow-up piece on how fatherhood has changed my leadership style. Katherine raised an eyebrow. And what did you tell them? That I'm unavailable for comment, as I'll be attending a second-grade science fair that day. Katherine smiled. Emma will appreciate that. She's been practicing her presentation every night this week. Another comfortable silence fell between them. These moments had become increasingly common, a shared understanding that required no verbal acknowledgement. There's something I've been meaning to ask you, Alexander said finally, his tone more hesitant than his usual decisive manner. The Morgan Foundation's annual gala is next month. It's typically a rather formal affair, but this year I'm keynoting about our new environmental conservation initiatives, many of which were inspired by Emma's interests. I thought perhaps you both might attend. Katherine looked surprised. You want Emma at a black tie fundraiser? We could arrange for her to attend just the early portion, Alexander clarified. My mother has already offered to take her home after dinner, but yes, I'd like her there, and you as well, he added, meeting Katherine's eyes directly. Katherine studied him for a moment. As Emma's mother, or? The question hung between them, touching on the subtle shift that had been occurring in their relationship, from co-parents maintaining a careful distance to something more complex, a friendship with undercurrents neither had directly acknowledged. Both, Alexander answered honestly. Your expertise in marine conservation would be valuable to many of our donors, and I would appreciate your company. Atin. Before Katherine could respond, Emma came running up from the beach, excitement animating her features. Dad, Dr. Holloway says the data from our tide pool shows 3 species that haven't been documented in this area before. We might be able to publish a paper. She turned to Katherine without pausing for breath. Mum, can we expand the monitoring area to include the point beyond the lighthouse? That's where the currents converge, and we might find even greater biodiversity. Nah, slow down, Emma, Katherine laughed. One research project at a time. Emma nodded seriously, then turned back to Alexander. Can I use the boat to check the outer monitoring stations tomorrow? Dr. Holloway said he'd supervise. Of course, Alexander agreed. I'll join you if that's acceptable. Emma's face lit up. You'll get to see the new sonar equipment in action. I've been calibrating it all week. As she raced back to her research team, Katherine turned to Alexander. You bought her sonar equipment. It's educational, he defended himself, though a smile tugged at his lips, and she made a very compelling PowerPoint presentation about its research applications. Katherine shook her head in mock exasperation. She's learning to speak your language, to get what she wants. She's learning to make persuasive business cases, Alexander corrected. A valuable skill in any field. The day continued with Emma directing her research team with surprising authority for a 7-year-old, while Alexander and Katherine moved between helping and observing. As afternoon turned to evening, the Yale students packed their equipment and departed with promises to return the following week. Dinner that night was a relaxed affair on Alexander's terrace. Eleanor joined them, her relationship with Emma having blossomed into one of mutual adoration. The Morgan matriarch had softened visibly in her granddaughter's presence, revealing a playful side neither Alexander nor Katherine had anticipated. As twilight descended, Emma convinced them all to walk down to the beach. She raced ahead with Eleanor, leaving Alexander and Katherine to follow at a more measured pace. "About the gala," Katherine said, returning to their earlier conversation. "I'd be happy to attend, both as Emma's mother and as your friend." Alexander felt an unexpected warmth at her answer. "Thank you." They reached the shoreline, where Emma was showing Eleanor something in the fading light, likely another marine discovery that had captured her interest. "It's remarkable how much she's changed you," Katherine observed, watching Alexander watch his daughter. "For the better, I hope," he replied. Katherine nodded. "Definitely for the better. 6 months ago, would you have imagined standing on a beach at sunset discussing tide pool research instead of closing a deal?" "Never," Alexander admitted, "though the Nakamura integration is proceeding exceptionally well," he added, unable to completely suppress his business instincts. Katherine laughed. "Some things don't change entirely." "Nor should they," Alexander replied thoughtfully. "I don't want Emma to know a different person than I truly am, just perhaps a more complete version." They reached Emma and Eleanor, who were crouched by the water's edge examining a shell. "Look what Grandma found," Emma exclaimed, holding up a perfectly formed spiral shell with iridescent interior. "It's a chambered nautilus. They're incredibly rare to find intact." "It's beautiful," Alexander agreed, genuinely impressed. "The nautilus is one of the oldest living species," Emma explained earnestly. "They've survived for over 500 million years because they keep building new, larger chambers as they grow." She looked up at Alexander. "They never stop adapting." Eleanor caught Alexander's eye over Emma's head, a knowing smile playing at her lips. The metaphor wasn't lost on any of the adults present. Later that evening, after Emma had gone to bed and Eleanor had retired to her guest suite, Alexander and Katherine sat on the terrace with glasses of wine, the sound stretching dark and peaceful before them. "I received a job offer yesterday," Katherine said, breaking a comfortable silence. "Director of Marine Conservation for the New England Aquarium. It would mean relocating to Boston." Alexander felt an immediate sense of alarm. "You're considering it?" "It's an incredible opportunity," Katherine admitted. "But Emma is settled here, her school is excellent, and her time with you has become so important to her." "To me as well," Alexander said quietly. Katherine turned to look at him directly. "I know. That's why I've already declined the position." Relief washed over him, followed quickly by concern. "Katherine, I don't want you sacrificing your career advancement for our arrangement. Perhaps we could find a compromise." "Alexander," she interrupted gently, "not everything is a problem to be solved. Sometimes it's simply a choice to be made. Emma's stability and happiness are my priority. Besides," she added with a small smile, "the Connecticut Marine Research Institute has offered me a senior position that's actually better aligned with my research interests." Alexander replied, feeling foolish for his immediate problem-solving response. "That's excellent news." "It is," Katherine agreed, "and it means we can maintain our current arrangement, which seems to be working well for everyone." Alexander nodded, taking a sip of his wine as he gathered his thoughts. "When I woke up in that hospital room 6 months ago and heard Emma call me Daddy, I was terrified," he admitted, "not just of the responsibility, but of failing at something that couldn't be fixed with money or corporate strategy." "And now?" Katherine prompted when he paused. "Now I'm still terrified," he answered honestly. "But it's a different kind of fear, not of failure, but of missing anything, any moment, any discovery, any growth. I find myself thinking constantly about the future, her future, in ways I never considered my own." Katherine's expression softened. "That's called being a parent, Alexander. Welcome to the club." And as the night deepened around them, the conversation turned to other things: Emma's upcoming school projects, Katherine's research, Alexander's new approach to corporate leadership. The easy flow of their discussion reflected the comfortable rhythm they had developed over months of co-parenting. When Katherine eventually rose to leave, she was staying in the guest house that night, as had become their custom during Emma's weekends with Alexander. He walked her to the door. "The gala next month," he said suddenly. "Would you consider it a date?" The question surprised them both. Katherine studied him for a long moment before a small smile curved her lips. "I would," she replied simply. As Alexander watched her walk toward the guest house, he reflected on the extraordinary chain of events that had led to this moment. A heart attack that should have been devastating had instead opened the door to a life he'd never imagined wanting, a life defined not by acquisitions and assets, but by tide pools and science projects and a child's laughter. The following morning, Alexander woke early and went downstairs to find Emma already at the kitchen table, surrounded by research notes and sketches of marine specimens. "Good morning," he greeted her. "You're up early." "The tide's at its lowest at 7:42 a.m., she explained without looking up from her work. "We need to be on the rocks by then to check the monitoring stations." Alexander glanced at his watch. 6:15 a.m. "Then we have time for breakfast first. What would you like?" Emma finally looked up, her expression serious. "Dad, can I ask you something important?" "Of course," Alexander replied, taking a seat across from her. "Are you and Mom going to get married?" The question caught him completely off guard. "What makes you ask that?" Emma shrugged with the blunt pragmatism of childhood. "You look at her the way Mr. Abernathy looks at Mrs. Abernathy at school, and they've been married for 37 years, and you invited her to your fancy party as a date. I heard you last night." Alexander couldn't help but smile at her observational skills. "Your mother and I are friends who care about each other very much. Whatever happens between us, what matters most is that we both love you, and that will never change." Emma considered this answer, then nodded. "Okay, but if you do get married, I want to be the flower girl and the ring bearer. I can handle both responsibilities efficiently." "I'm sure you could," Alexander agreed, marveling at her practical approach to life-altering possibilities. As they prepared breakfast together, a weekend ritual they'd established over the past months, Alexander found himself contemplating Emma's question. 6 months ago, the idea of marriage had been entirely absent from his life plan. Yet now, as he watched his daughter carefully measuring pancake ingredients with scientific precision, he found himself considering possibilities he'd never before allowed. Later that morning, standing on the rocky shoreline as the tide reached its lowest point, Alexander watched Emma and Katherine working together to document findings at the monitoring station. Their matching expressions of scientific concentration, the easy way they communicated with minimal words, the shared passion for understanding the natural world, it all created a picture of such natural harmony that Alexander felt something shift inside him, a final piece falling into place. Whatever the future held, whether as co-parents, friends, or something more, he knew with absolute certainty that waking up in that hospital room to a child's voice calling him Daddy had been the most fortunate crisis of his life. Not a liability to be managed, but the greatest asset he would ever acquire. My name is Theo Teller, and I want to thank you for joining me on this emotional journey of discovery and transformation. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel. Your comments about what you thought of Alexander and Emma's story would mean the world to me, and I'd love to hear your suggestions for future stories you'd like to experience. Remember, life's greatest treasures often come in the most unexpected packages, so don't forget to appreciate the connections that truly matter.